Good morning, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. I see that we have people here today, and I don't see any audio connections, so I assume that you will let me know by chat if you need anything. We are recording, so keep your chats clean and civil. Promised you that today we would talk about reports and cover a number of the features of setting up for reports and that sort of thing, and we'll talk about the quarterly reporting settings, etc., the stuff that's probably most important to you for using PIMS at this point as we move towards the new system. Before I start, anybody got any questions from the previous sessions? Just drop them into the chat and I'll either answer them now or save some time at the end for those questions. Anything? Okay, a couple questions coming in. Let's see what they are, and I'll see whether we'll do them now or at the end.
Hey, Lee,
Yes,
can you hear me?
I can.
Okay.
Good morning.
Okay. So I'll ask them if that's okay versus typing. Good morning.
It would be
Okay.
probably good.
Okay. All right. So going back to the date of last contact and date of final home visit.
Yes.
All right. You said those needed to be the same, right?
Yes, generally we've considered those to be the same thing. Do you have a nuance on that we might need to consider?
Well, sometimes they talk to them on the phone after the last home visit. Like we've had some that have called to say they didn't want to be in the program anymore, but it was after that final home visit. So I
Uh-huh.
was just wondering, do we still use the final home visit or the actual phone
Well,
contact?
here's the reason that we go with the home visit rather than a contact like a text saying, "Don't darken my doorstep again," or a phone call saying, "I've had enough and we're done." Um, the reasoning is that we want those two dates, the date of last contact and the date of the final home visit, to reflect a time at which you could have collected data. And
Okay.
so it's unlikely that you would be able to do an ASQ at the phone call that they called to tell you they don't want any more service, right? So we want to set those dates as cutoff dates that we don't expect any more data past those dates, and so keeping them consistently the same does that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And then when you're changing levels, is there a preference of when to change levels during the month?
Um,
Or is there a better time than
well,
another?
there isn't, um, because PIMS reporting takes into account uh, a prorated number of visits and case weight for people who change during the month. So that if a person starts during the month and they don't have a visit on the beginning of the month, or if they terminate, their last home visit is during the month, um, and they um, don't have a need for another home visit in the second half of that month, the calculation takes that into account by using the service start date and prorating how many days they got service, and the service end date and prorating how many days they actually got service, and calculating the expected home visits and the case weight based on those expected days rather than the full number of days possible in the month. Same thing when you change the service level, it calculates how many visits at one level and how many visits at the other level and prorates those. So you can change levels at any time. You don't have to go with, oh, we're only going to change them on the first of the month so that it only reflects the new service level, or we're going to change them at the end of the month so it reflects the old. It works to prorate it so you can change them anytime.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Nobody else typed in that they had questions in the queue, so I guess we'll go ahead and start with the reports section of this training. And to get to the reports, of course, you go to the standard reports button. Let me just go back there to the main menu. You'll see there's also the custom queries button. Custom queries are much more complicated. You can do simple queries pretty easily to get a count of number of people within a category or number of people within a date range. But when you start crossing people and categories like demographics, it gets much more complicated more quickly. So that's kind of beyond the scope of this training. I've got an email set to go to Crystal and Pat with some additional resources, which will include the PIMS YouTube channel that has a number of good videos, in which I'm putting the recordings of these current trainings on, as well as descriptions of things like what reports and how to run the reports for accreditation site visits and peer review visits. So those will go out after we're done today to Crystal and Pat to help with the process. And one of those is a custom queries training that Eileen did, who helps Rob. She's another consultant who works with Rob on PIMS and PIMS training and PIMS technical assistance. So sometimes when I don't know things, I send you to Rob or to Eileen to answer those questions. So standard reports. Now the standard reports interface is not the simplest thing to get your mind around, but it's pretty critical that you do in order to understand why you're getting what you're getting in reports. There are a number of settings that need to be taken into account when you're starting to use reports. So I want to spend the first part of this session on how to think about the settings in your standard report interface here. The first point is the site cutoff date that you see at the top of the interface. The site cutoff date is an important setting because it says any reports that you run are not going to look at any data after the site cutoff date. For that reason, you need to pay attention to that site cutoff date when you're running reports, and you need to keep it updated so that you're not cutting off data prematurely that you want included in the current report that you're trying to run. So, for example, if you're running reports today and it's January of 2019, you wouldn't want a cutoff date of 6/30/2018 because data from the third quarter or for second half of 2018 and the first month of this year would not be included in that, and you'd start seeing zeros showing up in places that you'd expected data to be. So in general, for running reports on like the most recent quarter or current caseload data, you would want to keep that site cutoff date to today, the day that you're running the report, or at the longest ahead, PIMS will allow you to set the final date of the current month as the site cutoff date. The site cutoff date also affects things like the mother's and child's age calculations. So if you want, if a report involves pulling people based on their age today and looking at things that are expected for them based on their age today, then you don't want to extend into the future further than you need to analyze. I've been running analyses for the past several months on site data and the aggregated statewide data, looking at the FY 2018 outcomes. For my purposes, I have needed to keep 6/30/2018 as the end date because that's the end date of the fiscal year 2018. I don't want to update and make it seem like the participants are older in their analyses by using a later site cutoff date than they are and have expectations of them getting immunizations and ASQs and things that they shouldn't have gotten yet. So the date I set was the end date of the period that I wanted to analyze. That's a good policy for you at the sites if you're reporting on your quarterly reporting to set the site cutoff date as the last day of the quarter that you're looking at so that the ages are calculated correctly and so that no data that was entered for a later period gets included in an analysis. Trying to say that even once. For our purposes, if you remember from the other day when we were looking at things in the data system of the fictitious Illinois site, Illinois 000, all of the data in the examples go from about 2002 to 2006. So I'm going to take a date here. And also you can use the calendar to set it if you're setting within a couple of months range, that works. But if you want to go to December of 2006, it's tedious to have to chart back through these calendar settings. So I generally just erase what's here and we'll put in 12/31/2006 to the site cutoff day setting. Now, when you hit enter for that or you tab out of it, it has to do some calculations, and you'll notice you can't do anything until those calculations are done. The background calculations help some of the reports that run a lot of queries to get those queries pre-done for everything rather than waiting until you click the button and then the reports run faster. So it does two processes: retention calculations and monthly contact table calculations. And when you click OK on the second one, you can start to make other changes. Okay, so that's the setting of the site cutoff date, and very important because of the limitations it places on your data and the importance of setting it and keeping in mind what you want to analyze when you're setting the site cutoff date. One thing is, if you leave it gone for a while and you run reports with a date that's later than the site cutoff date, it will prompt you that you can't look at data that's later than the site cutoff date. So it will stop you from doing some of the things that would give you a problem and remind you that you need to update that date. So that's the first feature that you need to understand. The second feature that it's important to understand is the case status setting. Almost all reports have a ability to use a set of date parameters to look at people who had a certain case status in between a set of dates. Pulling down that list, if you select all, what you're saying is, I want this report that I'm running to include all people who are in the database. Everybody. You probably would not run a report like that very often on your data, because you're most likely reporting on people on a quarterly basis rather than on the basis of everybody who's in the database. Okay, all's not very useful. Currently presumed active might be useful if you were working on a report that pulled just current participants. You would not usually use currently presumed active in terms of doing a quarterly report. If you're reporting on a quarter, let's see, not like this one, that's 5 years. If you're working on a quarter that has ended in like 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, you're trying to get your quarterly report out before the end of the month following the quarter. You might have people who were active in that quarter but have terminated since, in which case they wouldn't show up in your currently presumed active group and wouldn't show on your last quarter's report, which would make your last quarter's report inactive or inaccurate. So there are very few cases when you would want a currently presumed active case status to be your selection. The ones that you're most likely to use are the presumed active between and the service start between. When you're doing a short range, like a quarterly report, it's most likely that you would be using the presumed active between date range. So if we set this to 7106 and 93006, we would be looking at a given quarter, and we would be looking at all the people who are presumed to be active between those dates. By presumed active, we mean we believe on the basis of PIMS data that these people were active during this time because they have a start date that either occurred before this date or between these two dates. So they either were open at the beginning of the quarter or opened during the quarter. And if they have a termination, the termination comes after the end date of the quarter. The termination comes after the beginning date. So they were active at least at some point within that quarter. Okay. They have a start date that was before or during the quarter. And if they have a termination date, it comes after the beginning of the quarter. Or they have no termination date, and therefore we're still open at the end of the quarter. So setting presumed active is likely to be the most often used setting for looking at your participants for things like quarterly reporting and that sort of thing, or even monthly reporting. You would do the same presumed active. You would not do service start between on a quarterly basis, because then you'd only be looking at the people whose service start date was after the beginning and before the end of the quarter. And that limits the range of people you're looking at. It's pretty unlikely that you would do that unless you were looking at maybe the characteristics of the people who started during that quarter. But even with that, you'd be more likely to use a longer range than just the service start within a quarter to look at people. Does that make sense so far, I hope? I use the service start between dates a lot because in our evaluation work, we look at a 5-year period of every program's sort of historic data across a 5-year period to look at outcomes. It gives us a larger number of people to look at. It gives us a longer range. And in outcome terms, we believe it takes a while to show outcomes, and you want to include people from the earliest period as well as the latest period to average out how the site has done across a long term. And for the most part, when we do that analysis, we find that the healthy family sites in Virginia have been very stable for a long time in terms of having good outcomes, even when we look at them across a 5-year period. So it's beneficial to look at that way and present our history of doing well to our funders. When you guys do the shorter term quarterly reports, what you'll be asking is more for people who are active during this period. Did they receive the home visits? Did they receive the immunizations? Did they get screened with ASQs as they're expected to? Did they get screened with the home and the Piccolo to look at parent-child interaction in the home environment? So the most useful for you guys, presumed active between dates, and put in the date range that you want to use. Terminated, you're unlikely to do many reports on the basis of just looking at people who terminated. And if you do, it doesn't give you a date range to look at. So it's everybody in the database who's terminated, which to my mind is not all that useful of a way to do your settings for inclusion of people. So for right now, I'm going to leave that as presumed active and leave that as a quarter. I'll be changing these a little bit and show you differences when we move on into the actual reports. Okay. Selecting a cohort has two portions. What site are you looking at? And do you want to include or exclude any groups from your analysis? At your site, you won't have any option other than to look at your site's data, because that's what is included in your data system. The select site option is really only useful when you've aggregated more than one data file into an aggregated data set and want to look at one site at a time within that aggregated data set. So you'll be leaving select the site as at the way that it is, and groups. If you haven't set any groups, you won't have any groups to select from. Rob set up some groups in here: McBee families, Plymouth County, and transfers. And to select a group to use, you just highlight the group and click OK, and it shows up here. Then you can decide whether to use them to look at. If you want to look at those families, you would include them, and that report would only look at the McVie families in your data, the ones who are assigned, as we saw in the home form for the participants, as being highlighted on their home form. If you select exclude, then it looks at everybody else who fits the other characteristics that you've selected. Okay, to get rid of that setting of groups, you would click select again, not select any group, and click OK, and it takes that group out of the selection there, so you know that you're not including or excluding anybody. And then it doesn't matter whether it's selected as include or exclude. There's no group being used in the process. All right, so I'm going to look at another type of report here and show you how sometimes things will change depending on what report you've selected. If we go here to look at the child outcome checkpoints within a date range, you'll see that a number of other filters, selection points pop up that you have to be aware of. I'm going to stay within this select cohort here and look at the children. Generally, when we're reporting to funders, we include only the target children that we're that we are serving, and not all children. It's up to your sites to choose what you provide to other children in the household if you're serving families that have previous children, and what to provide to subsequent children in the family in terms of screening, helping them with immunizations and those sorts of things. Those are site decisions what to do, but for purposes of reporting, we generally use the target children only as our outcome criteria because they represent the people who we first work with the families. When a family has a subsequent birth and you work with that child, the mom already has the knowledge that you've provided her in her years of service leading up to that point. And So you're not starting from bringing a family in, bringing a mom in prenatally and working with her to get prenatal care. You're working with a mom who already has a history of knowing what she should be doing. And so you should, if you looked between target children and the subsequent children, you should find that the target children make larger growth, or the mom working with the target child makes larger growth than she does with the later children. And that's what we want to show. We want to show that we're helping these families. So if the family's already in a good place because you've worked with them for a couple of years, there's not that room for change, so we don't include that in the analysis. You'll also generally be looking at reporting across all of your staff and not an individual staff person. If you click the individual staff person, then you have to select who the staff person that you're looking at is. Now, sometimes it may be useful if you want to look to make sure that individual staff have been getting all the screenings done that they're supposed to get done, and doing all the helping all the families with their immunizations. If you want to look at individual staff's performance, that's a useful tool. But generally, when you're reporting to DSS or other funders, you wouldn't be using the individual staff method or filter. Okay. Gets a little complicated from here because we have more and more things we're taking into consideration. If let's go down here to the filter activities, which provides us another layer of what do we want to look at in this report. Checkpoints occurring between 7101 and 93006. So again, that's a 5-year period that you could look at all the checkpoints that a participant had during a date range. That's a long date range, and this report is going to aggregate over that and look at the expectation for a number of, in this case, outcome checkpoints. We're interested in the ASQ reporting and whether you've done as many ASQs as you should have done in the given date range. Since we've set this to look at presumed active within a short range, we have to decide whether we want all of the checkpoints. This would allow us to look at, for the people who were active during this time, all of their ASQs. If we set it for a shorter date range, which matches the case status this quarter, then we would be asking whether they had gotten the ASQs that were expected within the quarter. I'm going to change the dates a little bit here because I think there's not a lot of data in the 06 era. I'm going to change those to 2003. I'm going to change the end date of this to 2003. And I'm going to change the beginning date to 2000 to give it a little wider range. I'm going to see what I get here because, like I say, these are fictitious data and they don't always cooperate. Okay, doesn't look too bad. In that wide date range, in the narrow date range of the quarter that we're looking at, participants presumed active anytime between 7/1/03 and 9/30/03. There were 9 children eligible for the ASQs during that time. 9 of those children, notice here that we have both on time and to date analyses. On time asks whether the ASQ occurred within the month that it was expected to occur. To date asks whether it occurred up to the cutoff date for the participant. So oftentimes you'll find that the on time is lower than the up to date. For example, on the ASQSEs here, you'll see that 20 people had no screens on time and only 1 had any screens on time. But when you look at to date, 4 people had at least 1 screen, and the same 4 people got all of the expected screens. Looking at the ASQ line, and this would be the line that you would be looking at in a quarterly analysis to determine your ASQ outcome. We have 9 people eligible. All of them got at least 1 screen on time, and all of them got all of their screens on time during this state range. Likewise, when you have 100%, you can't get any better on your to date, obviously. I know that covered a lot right there. Are there any questions at this point? Anything I can clarify before I go into a little more depth here? I want to make the comparison of looking at the checkpoints that could potentially occur between 7/1/03 or 7/1/2000 and 9/30/03, that wider range of checkpoints. I'm going to next narrow that down and see if we get the same results, which I don't think that we should. So we go to print preview, close the report. So if we only want to look at checkpoints occurring in the same quarter, well, it happens that most of the activity happened in that quarter. The children who were eligible had 8 children, and all of them had their the ASQs that were due on time and therefore up to date as well. Let's see. All right, so a lot of stuff, I guess the way Rob entered the data for this, a lot of it was entered during that quarter for people. We can look at that in a little more detail. Notice that that was a summary. You also have an outcome checkpoints within date range that looks at individual data. Now it looks at all of the outcomes that we were looking at and the people who have things due during that quarter. See 9603, 8603, 9403. 8/25. Nothing should show up as a checkpoint date being analyzed unless it's within the 7/1 to 9/30. Is that the date range we did? Yeah, 7/1 to 9/30 date range. And we should find on here, in the 5 pages, we should find some people who had ASQs due during the time. 2-month ASQ here, 18-month ASQ here, consistent with the date range that we're looking at. Okay, if I go back and close this and put this date range back to 2000 again, we should find some people who had things due and in different months that weren't included in the last one because their final checkpoint occurred earlier. Okay, ASQs. This was before the 7103. This was before the, that's an SE. Let's see. So some of these are the same people we were seeing on the previous, like this one that was within the date range of 7/1 to 9/30/03. And some of them had and what we saw on the report, if you remember, was that this summary report had 9 people eligible, and the next summary report, where we narrowed down the date range, only had 8 people. So the one person we just saw with an ASQ at an earlier date range was the one who accounts for that difference. The other thing that you can do with these reports is there is a checkpoints within date range missing report. So that gives you, and it won't give us anybody missing a ASQ in this analysis because we just saw that of the 8 or 9 people, all of them had everything up to date in that range. But it will show you people who had missing KIPs, missing ASQSEs. So if you're trying to clean up your data, you run a report and you get a lot of people with missing assessments, missing screens that you're trying to look at, then using the date range missing only report is very helpful. Okay, so before I go too much deeper in that, let me or go through all the reports that you need to look at on a quarterly basis. I want to show you a couple of reports that look at previous information, and they provide you with some information that you don't have to look at on a quarterly basis for DSS necessarily, but which will be useful to you in your site visits with your TAQAs for looking at caseloads and at home visits. So going over here, monthly case management. And I find the monthly case management a little bit better, a little more useful than the weighted caseload, because you do look back to make sure that you have that you're staff are getting the participants the expected number of home visits, and documenting the occasions where they're not getting them, with why they're canceled, and those sorts of things. And you don't really look back to, well, what was the weighted caseload last month, so much as looking at your current weighted caseload. So let's look at the monthly case management report. Notice that there's not here a set of criteria, a set of filters that you can use to select which people, because by selecting monthly case management, you're saying, I'm going to look at this within a month, right? Excuse me. So you're already selecting a date range there that says we're looking at a month, and the filter that comes up for that lets you say, well, which month do I want? So let's go back here to 2003, September, and preview this report and see what we get. Okay, let me select a different month because I think there's a month that I want to illustrate. Let's see if June does this. I won't jump around too much on this if I can't find it, but no. Okay, this has got fewer people on it, but it does illustrate what I wanted to show you. So basically what this does is it looks at the people who are open during a particular month. Janie Danson and Pat Maldonado both were in services during the particular month, during the month of June. Pat, whose service level was assigned 4 months before, had been on that service level and stayed on that service level through the month, right? So at level 1, 4 visits are expected. She was on level 1 for 30 days in the month, of 30 days in the month, all 30. So 4 visits are expected. She got none during that month, so she had a 0 percentage completed. Janie Danson was assigned to level 1 during that month, on the 8th. Because she was assigned to level 1 on the 8th, she could only have 23 days of service because she missed the first week. Prorating 4 home visits for 3/4 of the time gives you 3 expected visits, and she got all 3 expected visits. Okay, so that is an adjustment of expected visits that is sanctioned by Healthy Families America in the way that they look at completion of home visits for participants. They know that if you didn't start until the second week of the month, you couldn't get all 4 visits in. And so that's allowed, and it calculates as 100%. If she'd been assigned the month before and was on level 1 for the whole month, she would have gotten a 75% rating here for 3 visits out of 4. Okay. let me adjust the date there and go back to 2003 and get a few more people. And on this, there's more than one page because we have more than one family support worker represented in the report. So it groups participants by family support worker and calculates for each participant the number of expected visits at their level, the days that they were served, the days in the month, then adjusts the home visits accordingly. Everybody in this caseload was open for the whole month, didn't change levels during the month, didn't leave the program during the month. Again, anybody over here that's adjusted? I don't see anybody. Okay, so it's two pages with 3 family support workers. Note that there is an asterisk, a red asterisk by some of the participants. That, I believe on the first page, tells us what that means. Denotes that no monthly contact log is entered. Last week when we set our definitions, we set the definition of counting home visits to come from the monthly contact log where those are recorded. If you do not enter a monthly contact log for a particular month, the case is going to show up as having no visits and being 0% completed. So that's problematic if you're trying to keep track of your record for completion of home visits. It provides you a problem if you're not recording monthly contact logs, then this report becomes unusable. It would be useful. The report would be useful if you had said in your definitions that you were recording home visit logs and using that as your count for home visits, and then we're actually entering every home visit log for every participant. Then this report would be useful because the definition here would be based on home visit logs rather than monthly contact logs. Another problem that you'll find is that if you're using monthly contact logs for tracking number of home visits, which most of our Healthy Families Virginia sites are, some of the reports of outcomes look at the date of the most recent home visit for calculating things related to getting ASQs done, getting immunizations done. And if you're not recording home visits on a monthly contact log, PIMS can't know when the last estimated home visit was. And so it will show you as getting no immunizations relative to that last home visit, or it will calculate it based on the date you've put in as the service start date and consider that the first home visit date. And then you're always looking at people who have only one data point of one single home visit. So very important to track your monthly contact logs so that you can look at monthly caseload management and so that you don't unwittingly, unknowingly have a negative effect on outcomes by not giving PIMS enough information about when they were getting home visits and whether they're considered to still be active or not. Okay. Let's look real quick at family characteristics. If you write grants for your program and you want to represent your data about what your participant caseload looks like, the people that you serve, you might want to take a look at all the people who started service in a given date range. And here, let's say from 2000 to 2006. So we have a good long date range. And that'll give you information about what the categories of ages of your participants are. Here, 34%, 33.5% are under 19 and under. So you can represent, what the age ranges that you're serving and the categories that are. You can represent your racial breakdown of your participants. Remembering that Hispanic is a separate category and that is reported after the subcategories here. Hispanic is recorded over here, so you would also represent what percentage of your participants are Hispanic. You get your marital status, your educational status, the educational status is the last reported grade that they've either completed or are in, and you also have what percentage are currently going to school, and employment information. How many are full-time, part-time, odd jobs, etc. Primary language and household income. At the very end of the report, you have your age based on the average age. Remember, up at the top we had the age breakdown into categories less than 15 and less, or 17 and less, 19, 18, etc. This gives you the average. Okay, question. Let me see if I've gotten more than one question. No, one question popped up in here. Is there a report that pulls locality, or is that something we would have to set up a group for? That you would have to set up a group for. There is no easy way for PIMS to provide locality breakdowns, given that you might have an address for the person. The address might reflect that they live in Richmond, but there are Richmond addresses in Chesterfield County, which is a different site service area. There are Richmond addresses in Henrico County, which is different sites. HF Richmond serves the city. HF Chesterfield Colonial Heights serves Chesterfield, HF Henrico serves Henrico. So from an address, you can't really tell where a person lives. Zip codes don't work because zip codes overlap localities. So the best way for you to get any reports that you could break out who was in a different county or locality is to create groups of those and assign. Make sure that you assign everybody to those. The nice thing about that is that we know from previous history that sites that serve multiple localities also have sometimes people that move back and forth between those localities. And the nice thing about having the group designation for the locality is that if they move, you can change their group. And it's just a matter of going to their homepage and clicking the previous group to turn it off and clicking the new group to turn it on. So hope that's helpful with that. Okay, it is 10 o'clock. I'm going to give a short break. Let's come back at 10 minutes after. It's 11 o'clock. It's not 10 o'clock. It's 11 o'clock, kids. Okay. We'll come back at 10 minutes after. Talk to you in a few minutes. All right, coming back to you. I want to make a slight divergence here because I want to talk. I think the most valuable information to give you is to stick to specific reporting requirements for the DSS quarterly reports. It's usually what people are most interested in, not obscure but lovely other reports. For the quarterly reporting process, you have to report on a couple of things that are not reported in PIMS. And for that use, we currently have the supplemental data system, which has been installed on at least some of your computers. Pat should have it available. Crystal should have it available. If it's not, or you haven't used it and need a little bit of help with that, I'm not going to do a whole lot of training on it because it's not that difficult. There is no data entry per se in the supplemental system. It draws its stuff from the stuff you've already put into PIMS for reporting purposes. So it's the main things you need to know with the supplemental system you're going to see right now. And like PIMS, where I spent the first portion going over how to set the parameters, I'm going to have to take a few minutes to discuss the parameter setting for the supplemental system. You saw in PIMS that the first thing that you had to set was the cutoff date at the top of the reporting menu. That cutoff date gives the last hard date that data are looked at in any report. That is similar to the supplemental system ending date. So we have a hard date. Remember I said I'd been looking at sites data up to 6/30/2018 for the 2018 fiscal year reporting. the ending date in the supplemental system gives us that same hard date as a cutoff, and all ages are calculated from the ending date, etc. So in the supplemental system, before you run any reports, you need to make sure that your data are current. And to do that, you update participant information. To update the participant information, you come to this menu, Supplemental System Update, by clicking the Update Participant Information button on the main form. You set your dates here. So we were using a broad range of 2000 to we can leave it with 630, 2006, I think. 2006 gives us a pretty broad range. And then you click on Update Participant Information. And it runs, does its magic, comes back to the wrong page. And you close that and come back to the Supplemental Data System main switchboard. And you'll see that these didn't change. That's not right. Update participant information. I hope I don't have a glitch here. Yep, got it that time. I don't know what happened the first time. Didn't update this page. So it's attached to healthy families, starting and end date, consistent with what we were looking at in PIMS. For your purposes, there are two categories of reports that you'll need to run for reporting. The DSS report section 3 provides you most of the data that DSS wants on their quarterly report, statistical report for the numbers of people you've screened, assessed, and enrolled, etc. Changes were made last year, and not all of the change numbers are reflected on the report, but most of them are. And because it's a quarterly report, when you go to run it, it asks you what quarter you want to run it for. So we want to run this for, and we're not going to run it for a quarter. I want to show you a lot of data, so I'm going to make it 2000 to 2006, and then we should get some numbers. Okay, so it shows the number of people you screen, the number of those that were positive, the number of positive screens who are eligible, and of those, how many families have an assessment pending. 170 people were assessed, 137 were positive, and these are breakdowns of how those positive break out. And then row K is your how many accepted home visiting services. I is how many were offered. K is how many accepted. And of those accepted, how many enrolled. Enrolled being also received a home visit after accepting. Number of home visits, total number by other staff, fatherhood specialists, or somebody else. Total number of other in-person contacts. Breakout of new families, old families, and the total number of families served. Okay, so that's there are a few places here that there are empty box, the total staff that made at least one home visit this period. The way PIMS is currently set up, that's not as easy a thing to pull out. So fortunately, most supervisors and site managers know how many staff are making visits during a given month. So for your reporting purposes, you can fill that in on the spreadsheets that are provided by Healthy Families Virginia for those reports. Okay. So that's one piece that's there to help you with that quarterly reporting. And then if you have weird numbers on the enrolled by dates and enrolling numbers, you can run these, which will show you who enrolled during the period, new families enrolled by dates, and new families with home visits by dates. Should be pretty close to the same list, but they draw from slightly different places. So this one draws from the now I don't remember where they draw from now, but they draw from slightly different places, so they might not have exactly the same number of people. Ongoing families, that was everybody in the report we just looked at. No, I'm sorry, that was there were no ongoing families in the report because I made this wide enough to encompass everybody who was opened in this data set. The other section that you can find useful is the quarterly reports data, because one of our objectives is prenatal care compliance. And that's one of the things that we need to report to DSS on a quarterly basis. Remember that when I talked about how to record the prenatal care data, you have the choice of entering medical visits as prenatal care visits to track them, and you have the option of recording in the override boxes after the delivery, when the child's born, and you know the outcomes of prenatal care. You can input the number expected and the number completed during service numbers, and so you can use one or the other of those, or if you've kind of mixed them across time and you're not sure, you can use the medical visits and override button. And that will give you a breakdown if there's any prenatal care data in this, which I believe there is. There is, but not a lot. So 31 enrollees had at least a month of service before delivery of their child. Of those, 6 have data included in their files, in their reporting. That's not a very good record. When we only have 20% of the participants with data, we don't have a really good feeling that those 6 can represent all 31. Okay, so maybe if the other 25 were in here, we'd have more than 2 attaining the objective. But this gives you the idea. It shows overall how many people were included, how many people had data, how many people attained the objective. If they didn't have data, what was it that they were missing? Gestational age is on the birth form. Prenatal medical visits are on the medical visits form. And then it breaks down how many had 100% of expected visits, how many had 80 to 99%, how many had less than 60% of their visits, did not obtain 60 to 79, less than 60%. So this is where you get your data. for prenatal care. Now, a question came in while I was going on there. So I'm working on this report right now. I would enter 10/1/18 to 12/31/18 to get what you just went over. Correct. That would be the quarter that you were looking at, and I'm assuming that on the main menu of the supplemental system, that you updated participants with a date range of at least I would use 6/1/2013 as the starting date to give you a 5 previous fiscal years cohort, because some of your people who are active in the last quarter have been active for years, and you want to include them, and 5 years is enough to include them. So update participants with 7/1/2013. I'm sorry, 6/1/2013 to today as the ending date, and then run the report with 10/1/18 to 12/31/18 to get what we just did. Okay, hope you got that, Gary. It's helpful when plans come together. All right. So when you looked at that report and you had missing data, these reports will help you figure out the missing data for your participants. Who was missing gestational ages? Who was missing medical visits? Okay. Also, if you want to know who are the people who had less than full coverage, and this only should have a few people, you can see that Verna had 25%. Celia was at 100%. We consider 80 to 100% to be full prenatal care. So these two were good. The rest were below what was expected. All right, and that lines up because we had 2 with succeeding and 6 who didn't. Or I'm sorry, 4 who didn't of the 6. All right, so that's the extent of what you need to know about the reports from the supplemental system. Going back to PIMS, okay, on the quarterly reporting form for DSS, you have children will attain prenatal care, moms will receive prenatal care during their services. That's what I just showed you, the prenatal care report. I'm not maybe going in exactly the order of the reports on that spreadsheet, but the other birth-related report is birth weight. For birth weight, you would look at the birth outcomes report category. Remember, you have to first select a category of report, then select a specific report. Now we have a new box that popped up here that we haven't changed the dates in before. Like I said, the filters for selection of the people you're looking at change depending on what report you're looking at. So let's go back here And we're using 7/1/2000 down there, so we'll use 7/1/2000 here. And we're looking at 9/30/2006 down there, so I'm going to do 9/30/2006 here. And when we look at the birth outcome, the two analyses of people who receive prenatal care are the prenatal care analysis in the supplemental system and the birth weight analysis in PIMS. We say for prenatal care that in order to be in the prenatal care analyses of prenatal care and birth weight, they have to have received at least 1 month of service prenatally. That's a pretty short time, but we don't want to include everybody because we didn't give everybody prenatal care. And we don't want to make it too long of prenatal care service because then we exclude too many people and we don't have enough people for the analysis. So we decided on 1 month. That would allow you, best case scenario, they're due to have 4 prenatal care visits, and you have them for a month and are doing 4 visits, so you could help them get 4 prenatal care visits. So, set the children between. If you're doing this on a quarterly basis, you want to look at the children born in that quarter. Now, if you look at children born in 1 quarter, in any given quarter, you might actually not have any children born, especially when you limit it to people who are in prenatal care for more than a month. So sometimes you'll look in a quarter and you'll find nobody because there just aren't any of the events that you're looking for. But keep that in mind. Okay, so for birth outcomes, the portion of this report that's most important for your purposes is the birth weight table up in the corner here. We exclude missing data, so we use the valid percentage here of participants, and we look at the 2,500 gram line. So our objective is that 80% of our children whose mothers receive prenatal care will have full birth weight. In this case, 93% meets that 80% criterion. We don't have a gestational age outcome on the DSS report, but you can look at that to see that usually birth weight and prematurity are pretty much entwined, and that the people that you're showing as low gestational age will also have lower birth weights. Closing that report. That's the only birth outcome analysis that we need to run. So next we would go to child outcomes. Actually, no, you need to look at a custom report, custom other states. There are 2 custom reports that we use in looking at these, and that's for this purposes medical providers by 2 months. So any children who aged up to 3 months within this date range, this report would look at as whether they had a medical provider in the first 2 months. Actually, let's see. Includes children born between oh yeah, that's right. I'm using a wider range, not a quarter. When you look at this in a quarter, you may or may not get any kids if you didn't have any births in that particular quarter. Looking over 5 years, we had a large number. At the bottom of the report, is there not a summary? I thought there was a summary at the bottom of this report. There's not, but it'll be enough people to count when you run it for just a quarter. You should be able to get that. So those are the people who had medical providers by 2 months. You don't have to worry about the subsequent births, which is a longer term and which they don't require you to report on a quarterly basis. So then, going back to child outcomes, under the child outcomes form, the first thing you need on the report is the immunization summary. And I generally use the immunization summary reflecting medical advice. You would set your presumed active for the quarter, and your immunizations due for the same quarter. We only look at immunizations and well baby visits when the child becomes 7 months old. We know that the first few months of service, when you're trying to get a lot done with the child, may be a bit chaotic, and it would be more useful for you to wait until 7 months to be able to look at that. So we don't start looking at 1 month, 2 months for children on immunizations. So you make sure you put 7 months in here in the minimum child age. That same field is used for the gestational age, right? So make sure that you note when you switch from the birth weight analysis to the immunization analysis that you change this. We have probably no kids that classify as having 7 months service prenatally, or very few. So if you use 7 months here and run the analysis of birth weights, you won't get anybody. Have to switch back and forth when you go from the birth weight to the immunization summary. So we go here. And we get not a lot of people with completed immunizations, but 16 people looked at, 10, and we don't use on time as before, we use completed. That's like the up-to-date analysis that I showed you on the ages and stages analysis. We give them a break for catching up with them, and that's part of why we don't look at them in the first 7 months. We figure that you can help them get caught up with immunizations by the time the child's 7 months old. Okay, so you would use, and our outcome here is the percentage of people 100% complete, and we have an expectation that 80% of our participants will have 100% of their immunizations for their current age. The next thing you would look at is up above, trying to do them in almost the order they're done on the quarterly report. Okay, you would want to run the outcome checkpoints within date range summary report for your ages and stages. That looks at, based on the checkpoints that we put in the definition for the ages and stages, which is that they have to have 1 by 7 months, 2 by 13 months, 3 by 19 months, 4 by 24 months, etc. And it calculates out to 2 a year in the first 3 years, and then 1 a year in year 4 and 5 if they're still with your program by that point. So this looks at whether they have had, if they had any due within the month, within the date range or the quarter that you're looking at, did they get them? And this we looked at before. I've changed the date range a little bit, so now we've got 10, and all of them were up on time on their ages and stages. The rest of the outcome instruments for the child, you don't have to worry too much about this report to get those numbers, because ages and stages is the only one that the outcome is a count of number of times we're doing it. For the ASQSE, we don't have an outcome criterion for ASQSEs. There's an outcome now. There's a standard in Healthy Families America's accreditation, but we don't have an outcome that's reported to DSS on a quarterly basis for that. Where these numbers, especially like the Piccolo now while we're still doing it, are important is that if you have 14 people, you need to make sure that you're getting them their Piccolos, because otherwise you can't do the analysis of whether they were within normal limits or not, right? So this tells you how many kids had them due, how many received them, and in this case, Piccolos were not being done at this site, clearly. All right. Then, as I showed you before, if you have a question about who it is that's missing things, like you have 17 kids here and 5 of them got it, who were the other 12 people, you would run the date range missing only for that, and you could count who the people were that were missing, and you could check their records to make sure it's not a data entry problem. Okay, so those are the ASQs analysis. For the Piccolo and the home, you want to run the child outcome scores within normal limits summary. And that says, at the first checkpoint, one child received the tool, and that child was not within normal limits, so did not score above the criterion cutoff for the Piccolo that's entered in the definition form. So the checkpoints, child checkpoints, tells you how many people were expected to get it and how many got it, and the child outcomes within normal limits tells you how many people, of those who got the tool, how many people were within normal limits. And so this bottom number here for the Piccolo would be the one you would be reporting on. Now, remember that when you run things on a quarterly basis, sometimes you'll get 0 people who are expected to have it. As your caseload people get older, they don't have something every quarter. You know, the kids who only need one ASQ because they're 4 years old, they're only going to get 1 quarter where they're expected to have an ASQ. So people may show up as nobody receiving the tool, and it doesn't mean that nobody it can be accurate with a 0 because you didn't have anybody who were expected to have it, especially if you have a small caseload and or an older caseload. Okay, so that's the child outcomes within normal limits. And then we have an outcome that's based on parents, where we do the piccolo with the parents, and that's parent outcome scores within normal limits summary. These are the instruments that in the definition forms are defined as parent tools, parent outcome tools. The Edinburgh, which we don't have an evaluation criterion around, but you have a criterion around the Edinburgh for accreditation, both the administering them and the point of how many are within normal limits, and if they're not within normal limits, did you refer them? The home, early childhood, and infant toddler are tools that we use for our participants to look at whether the families are whether the home is sufficiently developmentally appropriate for the child, whether there are toys, how clean it is, safety, stuff like that. And so this shows that 2 received the tool, and both of those 2 were within normal limits. Okay, so those are the reports that are most useful to you guys and that you'll most often be involved with looking at on a quarterly basis. Are there any questions about those? Well, I get nobody popping up and asking a question on it, so I'll move on to one last thing before we go, and then take any other questions before I let you bug out of here. It's not in our quarterly reporting, but it's a report that maybe across the use of PIMS I've gotten more questions about and more panic calls about why doesn't this work when I set it up. And that's the retention analysis report. So I want to go to retention. And this is a report that whenever you have a TA/QA visit, or at the point where we're going through accreditation, you have a peer review visit, it's one of the reports that can be useful to you. It's there is a spreadsheet that Healthy Families America has provided for doing the calculations, but in order to fill out that spreadsheet, you have to get out all the data that you've already entered in PIMS. And so since the report's here, I've always believed that it would be more useful to you to use the retention analysis report. Okay, so when you look at the retention analysis report, there's only a few items that you can set, but they're very important. In fact, they're critical to how you would get the information that you need. Now, we've said that the end of the people enrolled here is somewhere around 9/30, 2006. So I'm going to change this Now I'll leave it at 12/31/2006. It shouldn't upset the apple cart too much. The thing is that in the retention analysis, you have to keep in mind that you're looking at people staying in the program. In order to stay in the program 6 months, their enrollment date needs to be at least 6 months ago. I can't do a 6-month retention analysis if everybody in the analysis hasn't had the opportunity to be enrolled for 6 months. Right? So if we set a site cutoff date here of 12/31/06 and we select a year of enrollment from this would be 2005, and this would be from 10/1/2005 to 9/30/2006. 1 year to enroll people and 6 months retention. This has to be at least 6 months before the cutoff date to get a 6-month retention. Is it? No, of course it's not. It'd have to go back to 6/30. Silly. And so then let's make this 7/1 for a full year. Okay, let's try that again. 6 months. Okay. So this says, go to the header here, all participants who enrolled between 7/1/05 and 6/30/2006. That wasn't very many people in this data set. There were 4. Of those 4, 3 were retained through the time period and 1 left the program during the time period. Okay, so that means that your 6-month retention for this sample was 75%. Now, I don't have time to go into all the breakdowns down here, but when you have your real numbers for a year and you enrolled 40 people, this will break those 40 people down into how many of those 40 people were within each of these age categories. Of those people, how many in this age category stayed and how many left? Okay, it's hard to picture these analyses with 3 people in them and what it can tell you. But these analyses, the purpose is to allow you to say, are some categories of people not enrolling in services or not staying with services in greater proportion than other people? That is, do we retain more older women and lose more younger women? Do we retain more African American families and lose more white families? Do we retain more educated or less educated people? Or does education not matter because the breakdowns are similar? Okay, so that's an important analysis within the accreditation process, and it's an analysis that you'll be asked for in your accreditation site visit by the peer reviewer, as well as in your annual site visit with your TAQA to make sure that you're doing things on track. And like I said, there's a spreadsheet for doing it, but to do the spreadsheet, you have to get the data on each person and their date of enrollment, their date of termination, and their categories on age, etc. I believe since you're putting that information into PIMS, it's easier to run the report than to do the breakdown manually. Okay, so remember to do a 6-month, the end date here has to be at least 6 months in front of your cutoff date. To do a 1 year, you would have to move that back another 6 months so that it's a year ahead of this date. For any group, you can only do a retention analysis that's as long as the time between the ending date and the site cutoff date. As you saw, when I had set this to 9:30, it only had 3 months. The longest I could do here was a 3-month. Okay? So that pretty much wraps up the PIMS training in a nutshell. And I hope it's helpful to you, and that you'll be able to go forth and prosper with your data entry and your quarterly reporting. I'm going to be sending some things to Pat and to Crystal for checking in the data definitions and the setup of things, and then a list of these reports for quarterly reporting and the specifications of how to set a quarter, and to set the different parameters for them. I see one chat. Okay. Yeah, Crystal, we can make an appointment. Send me an email and we'll set a time to do that. All right. So thank you for your attendance and attention at these 3 sessions, and I hope you enjoy using PIMS hereafter. So take care and have a good weekend.